Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
I want you to just picture pitch black darkness for a second. Okay. You're standing in this disused water tunnel in northern Syria, and it's November 2024.
Right before the regime fell.
Exactly. And the air in the subterranean tube is so thin and just so unbelievably stale that the men around you are actually wearing oxygen tanks.
Just to stay conscious, yeah.
Yeah, just to not pass out. And in some places, the ceiling drops so low, it's like barely a yard high. So you're literally crawling in the mud.
That sounds terrifying.
Deep behind enemy lines, too. You're inching your way forward for 2 agonizing miles. And you know that at any second, just a single sound could compromise the entire mission.
It is just the ultimate pressure cooker. I mean, you have this elite unit of soldiers moving in, absolute disciplined silence.
Yeah.
And they are orchestrating an ambush that is about to permanently rewrite the map of the Middle East.
Because when these soldiers finally emerged from that tunnel at dawn, the target sitting there, just completely unaware in front of them, was Aleppo.
Right. And this was the very operation that severed the strategic supply lines for the Syrian regime troops.
It just triggered this mass panic among the defending forces, right?
Exactly. It set off the chain reaction that resulted in the rapid, stunning collapse of Bashar al-Assad's 24-year authoritarian regime.
And that was by December 2024.
Right. It happened so fast.
Yeah.
But the detail that completely stops you in your tracks when you actually look at the historical record.
Yeah.
The elite fighters who pulled this off, like the vanguard of this entire Syrian revolution, they weren't Syrian.
No, they weren't. They were Uyghurs,
right.
A predominantly Muslim ethnic minority from the far western Xinjiang region of China. And when you sit down and read Emily Feng's phenomenal reporting on this for NPR, it just completely rewrites what you think you know about proxy warfare.
Oh, absolutely. And global migration, too.
Yeah, completely. So, okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today for this deep dive is to figure out how an oppressed minority group from Western China ended up becoming the elite spearhead of a Middle Eastern civil war.
It's a huge leap.
It really is. And more importantly, we need to look at the massive geopolitical headache they are causing right now.
By setting up a permanent presence there.
Exactly. A heavily armed presence in a post-Assad Syria.
Because we are looking at a story full of intense contradictions here. You have these battle-hardened foreign militants who are now, running local gas stations.
Yeah, and holding government posts.
Right. All while the world's biggest superpowers debate whether they are freedom fighters or global terrorists.
So let's dig into the mechanics of that November 2024 tunnel assault. Because it wasn't some rogue improvised operation.
No, not at all.
It was masterminded through really heavy coordination.
Yeah.
You had Ahmed al-Shara, who was the key Syrian rebel leader at the time.
Not the leader of the country, by the way.
Right, exactly. And he was meeting secretly with Uyghur commanders to plan this joint assault.
And the tactical execution is really what stands out. The commander of this tunnel unit was a 31-year-old Uyghur named Hobed.
Wow.
Yeah, young guy. And he led his men through that claustrophobic space to execute a devastatingly perfect pincer movement.
So while they're coming out of the ground.
Exactly. So as Hobed's unit emerged from the ground behind the regime troops at dawn, a second Uyghur unit was waiting in the olive groves facing Aleppo.
Oh, wow. So they hit them from both sides.
They hit the regime forces from the front simultaneously.
It's like a real-life underground Trojan horse. And the regime troops panicked. They scattered, and literally within days, Aleppo fell.
And within weeks, Assad was fleeing to Russia.
But I have to stop here for a second, just challenge the premise of how we even got to this point.
Okay, go for it.
How does a group of foreign nationals end up with this kind of authority? To quote the researcher Aaron Zellin from the Washington Institute, they had an outsized role in someone else's civil war.
They really did.
If this is a Syrian revolution, why are Chinese nationals leading the charge? Why them?
Well, what's fascinating here is the sheer scale of their presence. And it built up quietly over more than a decade.
So they didn't just show up recently.
No, the Uyghurs didn't just parachute in at the 11th hour for the glory of taking Aleppo. They are the largest contingent of foreign fighters in Syria today.
The largest? Wait, how many are we talking about?
The community numbers around 20,000 people.
20,000?
Yeah, and that includes families, women, and children. Out of that population, there are roughly 4,000 active fighters.
That is a massive force.
It is. And over the last dozen years, they've earned a universal reputation across the region as the most highly disciplined, battle-hardened troops available.
So they aren't like mercenaries hired by a government for a specific job.
Right. No.
They had been bleeding into this soil for years. But if we want to understand how a community of 20,000 people transplants itself from East Asia to the Levant, we have to look at the catalyst.
We have to look back at Xinjiang.
Exactly. Which is, a subject with two intensely polarizing narratives, and it depends entirely on who was talking.
Right. The international reporting and the geopolitical stances on Xinjiang are just deeply divided.
Yeah.
You have the United States, which in 2021 officially labeled China's actions against the Uyghurs a genocide.
Right.
And this designation was backed by reports from the UN and various human rights groups. They documented extensive state surveillance, the mass confiscation of passports.
Basically locking people in.
Yeah, and a sprawling network of what they called re-education camps. In these camps, hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs were reportedly held, forced to study Mandarin, and made to memorize political speeches.
And then on the flip side of that, Beijing's official stance completely rejects those allegations.
Entirely.
The Chinese government defends their facilities and their aggressive security measures as necessary lawful de-radicalization efforts.
Right. They frame it around security.
Yeah, they argue these programs were specifically aimed at combating terrorism and separatist violence that had previously plagued the Xinjiang region.
So it is a stark, totally irreconcilable contrast in narratives.
Right.
But for the individual Uyghurs who actually made the journey to Syria, their motivations weren't driven by UN resolutions or geopolitical posturing.
No, they were driven by what they experienced on the ground.
Exactly.
And Emily Feng's reporting brings this to life through some incredible personal histories that really show you the human mechanics behind this migration.
Oh, the personal stories are amazing.
Take a man named Choital. Today, he's the 36-year-old deputy commander of the Uyghurs in Syria.
Right.
But back in China, he wasn't a militant. He was just a star high school student who wanted to study physics and chemistry.
Yeah, and his entire trajectory shifted on July 5th, 2009.
The Urumqi riots.
Exactly. There were major protests in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang. Uyghur students took to the streets, demanding an investigation into a factory brawl in southern China where 2 Uyghur men had allegedly been killed by ethnic Han workers.
And the police response was pretty intense.
Very aggressive. The situation in the city completely fractured.
It just spiraled into a horrific, bloody riot. Uyghurs attacked police and Han civilians. Han civilians retaliated against Uyghurs.
It was chaos.
And the Chinese government estimates at least 192 people died in the violence, while Uyghur advocates claim the number is much higher.
Right. And in the aftermath, hundreds of young Uyghur men were arrested.
Yeah, and Choital watched videos of this violence and the subsequent crackdowns, and he basically concluded that if he didn't leave China, he would eventually die in a prison cell.
And you see that same psychological fracture in the story of Guli, too.
Right, she was the doctor, wasn't she?
Yeah, a Uyghur doctor of internal medicine. She told her supervisor that after the 2009 riots, the ethnic tension in her hospital just became unbearable.
Wow.
She felt her Han Chinese colleagues looked at her with constant suspicion. It alienated her so deeply that she eventually walked away from her entire medical career in China.
Just left it all behind.
She followed her husband to Syria and literally completely retrained herself as a war surgeon.
I mean, if you're listening to this right now, you have to be wondering something.
Yeah.
Because fleeing persecution or discrimination makes total sense. People do that every day.
Right, of course.
But put yourself in their shoes for a second. You flee your home, but instead of seeking safety in a European country or North America, you buy a one-way ticket to a brutal war zone.
Yeah, it's not the usual route.
You go to a completely different continent and pick up a rifle. Why not just seek asylum?
Because they didn't go to Syria to become refugees.
Oh, interesting.
They went specifically seeking military training. The Uyghurs, who referred to their homeland as East Turkestan, by the way, felt that peaceful political activism had fundamentally failed them.
It just hadn't worked.
Exactly. They look back at a history of crackdowns following uprisings in 1990 against birth control policies, and again in 1997.
That was a pattern.
Yeah. By the time the 2009 riots happened, a faction of this community believed that nobody in the international community was actually coming to save them.
The logic they used to justify entering Syria is fascinating, though it's kind of haunting, to be honest.
What do you mean?
Well, there's a quote from a 40-year-old fighter named Nurmamet, and he basically laid out this cosmic bargain.
Right.
They arrived in Syria, saw the brutal oppression the Syrians were facing under Assad's military, and decided to intervene.
Yeah.
They hoped that if they could rescue the Syrians from Assad's oppression, they might earn the strength, the tactical knowledge, and maybe the divine favor to one day rescue their own people from China.
It's a profound ideological shift toward armed resistance. They viewed military strength as literally the only language that would guarantee their survival.
So they didn't go straight to Syria, did they?
No, initially they moved to Turkey, which has a large established Uyghur diaspora.
Right. That makes sense geographically and culturally.
But without proper residency documents, they lived in constant, paralyzing fear of being deported back to China. So around 2012, they started trickling across the porous southern border into northern Syria.
Which is just a massive gamble, because they didn't arrive as elite commandos.
Not at all.
As we just discussed, they were like physics students, doctors, and farmers. And they're stepping into one of the most complex, heavily armed war zones on Earth.
It's unbelievable.
How do you survive that learning curve without getting completely wiped out?
Well, they had to learn how to fight in the most unforgiving environment imaginable. And their defining crucible came in 2015.
Yeah.
By that point, they had clustered around a small northern city called Jizr al-Shugur. And that spring, the Syrian military bore down on them with everything they had.
Right. The regime attacked with heavy tanks and artillery. They advanced to within dozens of yards of the Uyghur positions.
Point-blank range for tanks.
And the Uyghurs, fighting alongside other rebel groups, they didn't break. They held the line.
Yeah, it took a month of incredibly bloody hand-to-hand fighting, but they permanently pushed Assad's armored forces out of the city.
That is wild.
And that battle cemented their reputation among the Syrian rebels. They proved they wouldn't retreat under heavy armor assaults. And from there, they began a process of intense militarization.
And here's where it gets really interesting, at least to me.
Oh, yeah.
It is as if they used the Syrian Civil War as a brutal live-fire university campus to build a professional military from scratch.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. They seized weapons from the defeated regime troops to arm themselves. But they didn't just learn to shoot. They learned to structure an army.
Yes.
They literally translated and studied the actual doctrines of the U.S., German, and British armies in their spare time to build internal discipline and command structures.
And that discipline was tested daily. We're talking about fighters enduring 20-day shifts on the front lines under heavy Russian aerial bombardment.
20 days.
Where they couldn't even take their boots off for fear of a sudden attack.
I can't even imagine that.
But we do have to address the complex reality of their alliances here.
Yes, definitely.
Because the Uyghurs formed a militant group called the Turkestan Islamic Party, or TEP. And as devout Sunni Muslims, they naturally aligned with other Sunni Islamist militias operating in the area.
Right.
Specifically, the groups that eventually formed Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
Wait, I have to push back hard on this.
Okay.
Because you're calling them a highly disciplined nationalist liberation movement.
Right.
But Hayat Tahrir al-Sham includes factions that used to be directly affiliated with al-Qaeda.
Yes, they do.
To any Western observer, that completely undermines their branding. It looks like they just traded one extremist label for another. Why align with them?
Well, it is the ultimate pragmatic compromise in a war zone. You simply cannot survive in northern Syria without coordinating with the dominant local power structures.
Okay, I get that.
But the Uyghurs drew a very strict, highly calculated boundary. At the time, ISIS was a massive political and military rival in the region, and the Uyghur leadership actively and publicly differentiated themselves from ISIS. They engaged in tactical diplomacy, telling the local Arab populations that they explicitly rejected ISIS's extreme fundamentalist interpretations of Islam.
So they drew a hard line there.
Exactly, both politically and religiously. They were hyper-focused on their own nationalist cause, deliberately avoiding the global jihadist ambitions that defined groups like ISIS.
Okay, so that strategic branding and that discipline is what kept them intact.
Yes.
So let's fast forward to the present reality, the aftermath. It's 2026. Assad is gone.
Right.
The Uyghur troops literally marched into Damascus in December 2024 to cheering crowds, throwing candy and flowers. The war is officially over.
It's wild to picture.
But you have 20,000 highly militarized foreign nationals who now have to figure out how to live in peacetime.
And we are witnessing a rapid, somewhat surreal attempt at normalization right now.
How so?
They are stepping out of the trenches and into the economy. They are running gas stations. They are importing cars into the post-Assad economy.
Right.
They're even setting up communal Uyghur language schools for their children.
And how do they actually pull that off economically? Because you can't just, open a dealership if you're stateless militia.
Well, they leverage their internal cohesion and their connections with the Uyghur diaspora back in Turkey. So they operate in this gray market that bridges the gap while the new Syrian state tries to build formal institutions.
That makes sense. But the psychological transition has got to be much harder.
Oh, definitely.
In those Uyghur language schools you mentioned, the kids are literally making paper and cardboard models of tanks and artillery.
Wow.
You can't just flip a peacetime switch on a society that has really only ever known war.
And the new Syrian government under al-Bashar knows this, and they owe the Uyghurs a massive literal blood debt.
Because they helped them win.
Right, so instead of trying to disarm them, they officially folded the largest Uyghur militia directly into the newly reconstituted Syrian National Army.
They just absorbed them.
Exactly. They've even appointed Uyghur commanders to officer posts within the defense ministry. And there's ongoing talk about granting them full Syrian citizenship.
I can't imagine the locals are thrilled about this.
It's tense.
You can't just integrate 20,000 foreign battle-hardened militants into a recovering, newly formed society without massive friction. They aren't Syrian, they don't share the same cultural background, and they spent over a decade occupying land during a brutal war.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the local reaction is incredibly strained, particularly for Syria's minority communities.
Right.
Outside of the northern strongholds, most Syrian Arabs had never even interacted with a Uyghur fighter before.
Yeah.
The report highlights a 75-year-old Christian woman named Denise Khoury from Latakia. She went back to check on her ancestral village after the war ended, only to find her family's home occupied by foreign fighters, including Uyghurs.
Oh, man.
She explicitly stated that Christians feel they can't live alongside them, fearing that these conservative Sunni fighters view them as infidels.
It's a very real crisis of integration, because during the fighting, militias commandeered empty houses in historically Shiite and Christian areas just to survive.
Yeah, that was common.
But now that it's peacetime, the new Syrian government and Christian leaders have forced negotiations. And this is where that strict internal discipline shows up again.
How so?
The Uyghurs are actively handing the land back.
Oh, really?
Yeah. A fighter named Bilal was quoted saying it is their absolute moral duty to guarantee security and respect property rights, regardless of a person's religion.
Well, it is a remarkably pragmatic approach to governance. They know they need local allies to survive in Syria.
Definitely.
But the truth is, the biggest threat to the Uyghurs in Syria isn't local friction.
What is it?
It is the international chessboard, specifically the long shadow of China.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Because China is watching this integration with intense alarm.
Oh, absolutely.
They recently agreed to reopen their embassy in Damascus, and their foreign minister made their position crystal clear. They expect Syria to not allow any entity to use Syrian territory to undermine China's interests.
They're putting their foot down.
Yeah, they even abstained from a UN vote to drop sanctions on Syria's new leader, and they specifically cited concerns about foreign terrorist fighters being harbored by the new government.
It's essentially a geopolitical poison pill.
It really is. Assad's new government desperately needs international investment and Chinese money to rebuild the country, but China is demanding they expel the very troops that won them the war.
And this demand relies on a wildly complex web of international terror designations.
How so?
Well, for a long time, the United States listed a Uyghur militant group called the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement (ETIM) as a terrorist organization, linking them to attacks inside China.
Okay.
But in 2020, the U.S. quietly removed ETIM from their terror list, stating there was no credible evidence the group even existed anymore in a meaningful capacity.
Which China immediately slammed as a politically motivated move by Washington just to apply pressure on Beijing.
Exactly.
And it's a diplomatic mess because while the U.S. dropped the designation, the UN and the U.K. still sanction them.
Right.
So how does this apply to Hobaid, Chot Tal, and the 4,000 fighters in Syria? Does China view them as ETIM?
Yes. China maintains that all Uyghur militants are ideologically united. They claim that the fighters in Syria take direct orders from a sanctioned al-Qaeda-affiliated Uyghur leader based in Afghanistan.
But what do the Uyghurs in Syria say?
They fiercely deny this. They argue they belong to the TIP, which is now disbanded and officially folded into the Syrian army, and that they have zero involvement with ETIM or any attacks on Chinese civilians anywhere in the world.
And the independent experts seem to validate that separation, actually.
Keep they?
Yeah. Edmund Fitton Brown, a former UN counterterrorism monitor, went on the record saying he has seen absolutely zero evidence connecting the Uyghur fighters in Syria to any attacks on civilians in China.
That's a strong statement.
And the fighters themselves are adamant that their quarrel is strictly with the Chinese state apparatus.
It really highlights the isolation of this Syrian branch. While a handful of early, older members might have had ties to training camps in Afghanistan decades ago, today they are functionally independent.
So they're on their own.
Yeah, they are hyper-focused on their own nationalist survival, completely divorced from global jihadist networks.
So what does this all mean? That the war in Syria is won, they have a battle-hardened army of 4,000 troops. Are they actually going to march across Asia to invade China?
No, and they are fully aware of that reality. They are incredibly pragmatic.
Okay.
Chotal, the deputy commander, openly acknowledges that attacking China's massive, highly modernized military right now would be suicidal.
I mean, obviously.
So they are biding their time. And this leads to perhaps the most surprising detail in the entire investigation.
What's that?
Uyghur officers in Syria are actively studying the Zionist movement.
Wow. That is an incredibly unexpected historical parallel to draw. What exactly are they looking at?
Well, they are analyzing the mechanics of state building. They are looking at how the Jewish people, after facing centuries of displacement and persecution, managed to restore their unity.
Right.
How they slowly built a military capability and eventually established a state in the 20th century. The Uyghurs are hoping to replicate that long-term, multi-generational strategy for East Turkestan.
So it's a very long game.
Extremely long. They believe the Chinese Communist Party will eventually collapse under its own weight, and when that day comes, they want a professional, trained army ready to step into the vacuum.
But until that hypothetical day arrives, they're just stuck in this strange, permanent limbo.
Yeah, they really are.
They consider Xinjiang their homeland, but they have bled so much into the soil of Syria that it has become a home too.
And Emily Feng's report ends with this incredibly moving image that just captures this perfectly.
The cemetery.
Yeah. High on a hill outside Jizr al-Shugur, the city where they proved themselves against Assad's tanks, there is a makeshift cemetery among the green shrubs. It's filled with the graves of hundreds of Uyghur fighters.
The visual contrast is striking. You have these stark white gravestones set against the rusty red soil of northern Syria.
Right.
And because they died in the absolute chaos of war, often under heavy Russian bombardment, many of the gravestones don't even have full names on them.
Yeah, they just have their noms de guerre, their combat aliases, carved into the stone.
And a surviving fighter named Enes points to his friend's grave and basically summarizes their entire existence. He says, we don't want our children to wander in foreign lands forever. If we can't liberate our homeland in our lifetime, maybe we can open the path for our kids to do it.
It's powerful. And this raises an important question, one that really sits at the intersection of human endurance and global politics.
Yeah.
History is absolutely full of proxy wars. But what happens when a displaced stateless army doesn't just go home or disband when the fighting stops?
Right.
What happens when they become a permanent, integrated fixture in a newly formed nation's official military apparatus?
How does a fragile new government in Damascus balance this deep, literal blood debt to the foreign fighters who put them in power against the crushing economic and diplomatic demands of a global superpower like China?
It's a nearly impossible position.
The oxygen might have been thin in the water tunnel back in 2024, but the diplomatic pressure they're facing now out in the open is only getting heavier.
Absolutely.
It is something we're all going to have to watch very closely as the region tries to rebuild.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. Remember, these sources are just the beginning of the journey. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.